Our history is no more than a series of incredible events. Every one of us can influence its course. From the birth of a 1,000-year-old empire to the death of a flourishing civilization. From the creative genius of a handful of men to a worldwide cultural revolution. From the darkest of totalitarian visions to the most horrific of great wars. From the heroic resistance of an entire people to the iron determination of a minority. The most infinitesimal of our decisions can influence the future of humanity. To know the past is to foresee the future. August 29th, 2161, Red Square, Moscow. Nuclear bunker number 214. 200 years ago, following a global thermonuclear war, humanity was almost annihilated. Those who were able to hide in vast underground shelters just before the final strike survived 2 centuries of nuclear winter. The others succumbed to radioactive fallout. Cut off from the outside world, new generations were raised in the belief that the planet had become uninhabitable, and yet, profiting from the absence of man, it reclaimed its own and has almost entirely wiped out all traces of human civilization. But none of this ever happened. A few decades earlier, 2 leaders will manage to keep cool heads and avoid the apocalypse. December 2nd, 1956. Fidel Castro, a former lawyer in exile, lands on the Cuban shores with 81 guerrilla fighters. October 14th, 1962. An American U-2 spy plane flies over mystery installations in the heart of the island of Cuba. October 27th, 1962. The commander of a Soviet submarine is on the point of launching a nuclear torpedo at a U.S. Navy vessel. These 3 intimately connected events are the key moments of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they took humanity to the brink of a third world war. Cuba. A Caribbean island. It becomes a Spanish colony in 1492 and then an American protectorate. In reality, at the beginning of the 20th century, the imposing neighbor controlled the country. A succession of dictators obtained political and military support from the Americans in return for commercial advantages. Following the coup of 1952, Colonel Batista becomes the Cuban head of state. After increasing his salary by 5 times, he suspends the Constitution, reintroduces capital punishment, and bans the right to strike. On the island, corruption is the only thing rising faster than poverty. Batista, close to the mafia, welcomes gambling, prostitution, money laundering, and drug trafficking. The United States lets it happen. Trade relations with the island are more important than Cubans' rights. But poverty and deprivation are fertile ground for opposition. On December 2nd, 1956, Fidel Castro, a former lawyer in exile turned guerrilla, lands with 81 partisans. The rebellion rapidly swells. It turns into a civil war. At the beginning of 1959, the dictator Batista flees. Castro, at the head of the revolution, can implement his political program. Promotion of education and health, equality between men and women, the right to vote, but most important, nationalization of American companies. The American government sees red. For them, Castro is a communist and therefore an enemy. Relations between the 2 countries rapidly deteriorate. In October 1960, the United States imposes a trade embargo, then cuts off all diplomatic relations. No more American goods, sugar exports plunge. Cuba is throttled. Deprived, isolated, the island has just lost its principal trading partner and doesn't know whom to turn to.
Welcome to the memory of humanity. Here we can control time, analyze and compare billions of events, and alter them to rewrite history endlessly. All the events in our history, however minute they might be, are memorized and interconnected. It only requires one to be changed for all the others to be shaken to the core. What is the difference between an embargo and a blockade? An embargo is an economic sanction imposed by one country against another. It means cessation of all commercial exchange with that state in order to put it in a position of shortage and force it to negotiate. A blockade is an act of war. It means the forceful prevention of exchanges between a country and the rest of the world. Whether maritime, land, or aerial, it is like a siege. Nobody can enter or leave the country. In 1977, the UN embargo on arms sales to South Africa contributed to the questioning of the apartheid regime. In 1990, the UN embargo on Iraq ruined the country and produced grave consequences for the health of its population. In 1960, an official embargo is placed on Cuba by the United States. In reality, it is a blockade. Deprived of its principal partner, the island is left isolated. Faced with shortages, people may radicalize. The situation then becomes worse than before.
(1960), the port of Havana. After crossing the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of barrels of oil are landed from imposing cargo ships. Imported from the USSR, Soviet oil is allowing Cuba to hold out. For Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, this is the chance to strike a blow to his American adversary. For 15 years, the two superpowers have been engaged in an unofficial war, the Cold War. Yet in 1945, the two states were allies. Together, they defeated Hitler. But that alliance was fragile. The United States is an economic and military superpower. The Soviet Union aspires to become one. Very quickly, incomprehension arises between the former allies. The two powers are based on incompatible ideological and economic systems. Each tries to attract other countries to it, countries that join them by choice or by force. Capitalists against communists. Western Bloc against Eastern Bloc. The world is divided. An iron curtain descends over Europe. In 1949, tension ratchets up with the creation of NATO. The armies of Western Europe ally themselves with those of the United States. In August of the same year, the Soviets developed their first nuclear bomb, catching up to the Americans. All through the decades that follow, the two nuclear superpowers never confront each other directly. The conflict is waged by proxy by intermediate countries: the Korean War, Berlin Wall, Vietnam War. In 1962, the Soviet Union seizes the occasion. Cuba, lying less than 100 miles from the American coast, is a strategic position for the new nuclear missiles.
Victory comes from superior firepower. During World War II, the Americans developed the first nuclear bomb. In 1957, the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite using the most powerful space rocket ever designed. These two technological advances are the two pillars of one of the most destructive weapons ever invented, the ballistic nuclear missile. This weapon was designed to rain nuclear fire at the other end of the Earth. The largest missiles are 32 meters high, like the Soviet R-36. They are autonomous and can travel a distance of up to 11,000 kilometers and hit a target on the other side of the globe within an accuracy of 700 meters. There are many variants. Some are launched from giant land silos spread across the country. Others are placed on mobile transporters. Finally, some are invisible to the last moment, fired from submarines that have infiltrated to the very coasts of the enemy. The objective is total annihilation of the enemy. In case of a conflict with another country disposing of similar weapons, the only certainty is that it's best to strike first.
April 17, 1961. 1,400 anti-Castro Cubans, trained and equipped by the CIA, land in Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. Supported by the United States, this military invasion's objective is to overthrow the Cuban government. It's a disaster. For the United States, it's a humiliation. For years, the CIA has been trying in vain to destabilize the regime. Bombing, sabotage, terrorism, propaganda, embargo. Nothing works. On the contrary, each attack brings Cuba a little closer to the Soviet Union. And yet, Fidel Castro is not a communist. On several occasions, he even tries to resume relations with the United States. All the Cuban leader asks is for the right to decide his own political line. But America's aggressive attitude pushes Castro into the arms of the Soviet Union. The point of no return is being crossed. At the end of 1961, the United States begins setting up 15 Jupiter-class ballistic missiles in Turkey, aimed at the Soviet Union. They are a direct threat to Moscow. In May 1962, in response, Castro and Khrushchev decide to set up missiles on the island of Cuba to defend it against a possible American invasion. Castro moves over to the east. At the beginning of July, Khrushchev gives the green light for Operation Anadir. 50,000 soldiers, 36 long-range nuclear missiles, 40 MiG fighters, anti-aircraft batteries, bombers, tanks, and 4 submarines. All of this is transported aboard 86 ships. The Soviet Union is flexing its muscles. Highly strategic, this operation is classified as a defense secret. During the first weeks, the United States is unaware of anything. On September 8th, the first missiles reach Cuba. The first launch site is rapidly set up. On the 28th, a U.S. Air Force reconnaissance plane spots a cargo ship. On its deck, it photographs plane parts that seem to belong to bombers. The United States is then convinced that the Soviets are spending a fortune transporting nuclear weapons. But for now, they can prove nothing.
If you want peace, prepare for war. After the horrific bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no country has ever dared to use nuclear bombs. A weapon useless? Not really. The aim is not to use it, but to threaten to use it. That is the principle of deterrence. Nuclear deterrence uses terror. The more nuclear arms a country possesses, the more it creates fear and respect amongst its neighbors. The United States possessed as many as 33,000 nuclear warheads, the Soviet Union 41,000. When you realize that a single one of these weapons can wipe a country the size of London from the map, you think twice before you start a fight. The problem with this strategy is that it relies entirely upon the decisions of its leaders. How do you interpret an aircraft that's strayed from its route and enters your aerial space? How do you react to an accident that you think could be an attack? In the middle of the Cold War, when provocations occur on a daily basis, this doctrine can plunge leaders into a real impasse. With each threatening the other with nuclear attack, neither able to take action or retreat, the situation can become explosive.
October 16th, 1962, 8:45 a.m., Washington. American President John F. Kennedy is facing an unprecedented situation. His aerial reconnaissance experts are absolute. The Soviets are setting up R-12 missile launch ramps in Cuba. Miami is directly threatened. According to the experts, the missiles will be operational within 10 days. At once, under the pretext of a full-scale military exercise, the U.S. Navy deploys off the coast of Cuba. The Strategic Defense Alert level is at level 3 on a scale of 5. Level 1, or DEFCON 1, means the country is at war. Officially, the USSR is stating that no nuclear missiles are installed in Cuba. However, during the following days, U-2 reconnaissance planes photographed more launch sites, and they appear to be operational. Over the North Pole, fleets of B-52 strategic bombers carry out continuous patrols. Armed with nuclear weapons, they are ready to bomb the Soviet Union at any moment. At 6 p.m., Khrushchev is warned. If the missiles are not withdrawn, the United States will retaliate. 7 p.m., Kennedy addresses the nation. He announces that the United States will not stand by and do nothing and that he is placing Cuba under quarantine. October 23rd, the Cuban army is on a war footing. In Europe, the Soviet armed forces are in a state of alert. At 6:51 p.m., Kennedy informs Khrushchev. The two sides must make an effort to avoid any incident erupting. October 24th, an 800-kilometer American naval blockade is in place and effective around Cuba. Officially, it is still a quarantine. The first Soviet freighters arrived within the zone. Faced with the impressive American fleet, they reduce speed or stop their engines. Those carrying the last of the nuclear missiles are ordered to turn around. Tension is at its height. The least false move can ignite the powder keg. Under the water, invisible, the Soviet submarines brave the American warships. Khrushchev writes to Kennedy, the blockade is an act of aggression. He's going to ignore it and carry on. 10 p.m., the United States prepares for imminent war. The defense alert level rises from DEFCON 3 to DEFCON 2. In their silos, 145 nuclear missiles are made ready to be launched in less than 30 minutes. China states its support for the USSR. The world is on the brink of war between two nuclear superpowers. On October 26, Khrushchev offers a compromise. He is prepared to give up the defense of Cuba if the United States promises never to invade the island. On the same day, without any knowledge of this offer, Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, offers the withdrawal of the American missiles in Turkey in exchange for the dismantling of the Soviet installations in Cuba. On the brink of the abyss, a diplomatic solution is on the horizon. If Kennedy seizes the opportunity, the crisis can still be diffused. But on October 27th, a U-2 spy plane is shot down over Cuba. Khrushchev immediately orders the Soviet commanders to stop shooting. Kennedy keeps a cool head and calms his military command. More seriously, right in the heart of the blockade, submarine B-59 has just been detected. It's being pursued by 11 U.S. Navy destroyers and an aircraft carrier. The Americans drop training depth charges to force it to the surface. These charges are harmless, but the Soviet commander doesn't know that. Without news from Moscow for 24 hours, his officers hesitate and can't agree. Has war broken out? According to procedure, when attacked, they must retaliate with a special torpedo, a nuclear torpedo. The weapon is loaded into the torpedo tube. The crew is prepared to open fire on an American ship and start the Third World War. But at the last moment, the commander decides not to fire.
We have just reached a turning point. A turning point is a key event, a crossroads in our history where the world swings one way or the other. The commander of the Soviet submarine decides not to launch his nuclear torpedo. Let's imagine what might have happened if he had followed procedure. The explosion would have impacted on all ships in the area. In reaction, the United States would have moved to DEFCON 1. The bombers patrolling the North Pole would have been ordered to drop their bombs on the Soviet Union. From the United States territory, 100 intercontinental missiles would have lifted off into the stratosphere and then unleashed their nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union would have immediately retaliated with its nuclear submarine launches. The Third World War would have been a global thermonuclear war. The last one. From space, the globe would have been lit up by a host of strikes. Within 2 hours, hundreds of millions of people would be dead, and the planet would have been plunged into a nuclear winter. Radioactive clouds would have shrouded the contaminated Earth for centuries. The decision by a single man that would have annihilated humanity.
On the morning of October 28th, humanity is still here. The previous day, President Kennedy accepted the Soviet offer. At 9 o'clock on Radio Moscow, Khrushchev announces the dismantling of the missiles in Cuba. Fidel Castro, abandoned by his ally, is furious. Kennedy publicly declares that the United States will never invade Cuba. This is an enormous concession. Secretly, he promises Khrushchev that he will withdraw his missiles from Turkey, a decision considered to be a weakness by some of his military staff. The two leaders, each under militaristic pressure from their advisors, were able to keep cool heads and common sense. Throughout the crisis, they never stopped communicating with each other. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the only moment in our history when the DEFCON 2 level was reached. On November 20th, American land forces returned to DEFCON 4. The airborne defenses will only return to level 3 in 1965. This crisis brought the world back to reality by bringing it to the brink of a total war. From August 1963, a permanent liaison is established between the Kremlin and the White House, the Hotline. In May 1972, the SALT I treaties limit strategic nuclear weapons. The two superpowers commit to limiting the number of atomic weapons. Today, there are still more than 15,000 nuclear weapons. In 2016, France, the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, and Israel voted against a UN resolution aiming to bring negotiations forward on nuclear disarmament. Nevertheless, 123 states voted for, which will make 2017 the year of talks. But that is another story.
It's all about communication. For the American president, as much for his Soviet counterpart, credibility, reputation, and prestige seem to have been as central to their decisions as reasons of state. Having once reached a certain point, neither could retreat without losing face with his people and his political class. Khrushchev had to show Castro, and therefore all the other leaders, that he was strong and able to protect them. Kennedy had to prove that he was able to make the Soviets back down. How do you not lose face? Who has the courage to lay down his arms first? Who decides to fire? But these personal considerations impacted upon billions of human beings. Today, after the end of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the death of Fidel Castro in 2016, these tensions appear to have eased. And yet, the Russian Federation has recently announced the development of a new intercontinental missile of unparalleled power, the Saturn II, capable of wiping out a whole region. The saying goes that man is a wolf to man. Throughout his history, he has never ceased to invent new weapons to destroy himself. But he has also learned from his mistakes and been able to turn back when necessary, as during the Cuban crisis. Because in 1962, although humanity was foolish enough to go to the brink, it was also intelligent enough to step back.